A nurse was unjustly fired for helping an elderly woman who was humbled and wearing dirty clothes. 5 days later, he was stunned to receive a call. As another workday came to a close at Sunrise Care Hospital, Damien Montgomery exchanged farewell greetings with his colleagues while reviewing the day's last notes. Fatigue was a constant companion resting on his shoulders. Damien's face bore the expression of someone bearing enormous responsibilities. He was the husband of Eleanor, a dedicated elementary school teacher, and father to Valeria, a beautiful 5-year-old girl. "Let's face a new day tomorrow, Damien," he encouraged himself in a low voice while changing in the locker room. His colleagues around him were already starting conversations about plans for the evening. "Thinking of hitting a party tonight, Damien?" one of them teased amid laughter. "No, tonight my company will be medical books and Valeria's school homework," Damien replied, offering a smile that mixed exhaustion and contentment. Committed to nursing, he harbored the dream of becoming a great doctor. Nights were times for intense study without neglecting care for his daughter. Eleanor, in turn, also split her time between her profession and household chores. At home, Damien strived to support his wife while dedicating himself as much as possible to his studies. As he walked to his car, parked within the hospital premises, Damien delved into reflections on his personal journey. Coming from a simple home, each step forward represented a significant effort. Being admitted to Sunrise Care Hospital, a prestigious institution in his city, was a significant milestone. "You have a bright future ahead of you, Damien. Never doubt it." The memory of his father's voice, now deceased, was a constant comfort and encouragement. Starting his car, he called Eleanor. "Hello, my love, I'm on my way. Need anything?" he inquired affectionately. On the other side of the line, Eleanor's sweet voice responded, "No need, love. Come safely. Valeria can hardly wait to show you the drawing she made at school today." Arriving home, he was greeted with a warm "good evening" from Eleanor, who was preparing dinner. "How was your day, dear?" she asked, turning to him with a smile that brightened the room. "The day was good, Eleanor," Damien shared, with a smile hiding his fatigue. "I was eager to get this job at Sunrise Care. You know how essential money is, especially now with the costs of Hazel's treatment." "Of course, my love, I see how hard you work," Eleanor said, looking at him with a gaze full of empathy. "And how was it at the hospital? You seem worried." With a deep sigh, Damien vented about the demands of his supervisor, Dr. Harrison. "He's very strict, and I feel like nothing I do is enough. He seems to be always upset with everything and everyone," Damien confided. "But that's why you're studying to be a doctor, isn't it? To be able to do more for Hazel and other patients," Eleanor reminded him as they served dinner. "Yes, it's true. Every day I spend at that hospital I learn more, and it gives me more strength to continue with my studies," Damien agreed with a thankful smile. After dinner, while Eleanor tidied up the kitchen, Damien went to Hazel's room, who was already asleep. As he looked at her, sleeping like an angel, not seeming to be ill, he felt a wave of determination. "I'll do everything to give you a better life, my little one," he promised silently. At that moment, the exhaustion gave way to a renewed sense of purpose. Damien knew the journey would be long and difficult, but looking at Hazel, he was sure it would be worth it. The following morning, Damien woke up before dawn, preparing himself for another challenging day. Before going to work, he had a crucial appointment, taking Hazel to a routine medical checkup. The calm atmosphere of the morning gave no hint of the storm of worries forming in his mind. Arriving at the pediatric hospital, Damien held Hazel's small hand, trying to hide his anxiety. The consultation proceeded as usual until the doctor gave them unexpected news. "Hazel's treatment needs to be intensified," the doctor explained. "This means a more effective but also more expensive medication that we need to import." Damien's heart sank. How could he afford these additional costs? On the way back home, Damien was absorbed in thoughts. He began to consider all possibilities to increase his income. "Maybe I can take extra shifts at the hospital, or do additional jobs on weekends, like taking care of neighbors' gardens," he thought, desperate to find a solution. The concern was visible on his face, while Hazel, oblivious to adult problems, hummed a children's song in the back seat of the car. Leaving Hazel at home with Eleanor, Damien rushed to Sunrise Care Hospital. The urgency of the moment made him lose track of time, and he arrived 5 minutes late. As soon as he entered, he was confronted by Dr. Harrison. "Damien Montgomery, you are late," Dr. Harrison said with a tone of disapproval. Damien tried to explain. Dr. Harrison, I had an important medical appointment with my daughter this morning. But he was interrupted by Dr. Harrison, who coldly said, Damien, you are new here. No matter the reason, we expect punctuality. This cannot happen again. Damien nodded, holding back the frustration and worry that threatened to overflow. After a tumultuous start to the morning, the rest of Damien's day at Sunrise Care Hospital went without further incidents. He dedicated himself to each patient with the attention and care he always valued in his work. The hospital, known for its excellence and affluent clientele, maintained an atmosphere of calm and sophistication. During his brief rest period, Damien retreated to a small room reserved for workers, seeking a moment of tranquility amid the chaos of his day. While resting, Damien's thoughts drifted between concern for Hazel and pressure at work. He wished for just a few minutes of peace before resuming his tasks. However, this brief moment of calm was interrupted by unusual activity coming from the reception. Curious and concerned, Damien decided to check what was happening. Upon arriving at the reception, he encountered a chaotic scene. An elderly lady, dressed in dirty and humble clothes, was clearly in distress. She could barely stand and asked for help with a weak and trembling voice. The receptionist, Violet, looked at the lady with an expression of discomfort. Please, I need documents or your health insurance card to assist you, Violet said, trying to maintain her composure. The lady, gasping and visibly ill, responded with difficulty, I don't have my documents. Please help me. Her voice was a desperate whisper and she seemed on the verge of fainting. Violet, visibly bothered, replied, I'm sorry, but this is a private hospital. You need to seek a public hospital. We can't assist you here without the necessary documents. Please call Dr. Aurora Campbell, the lady pleaded with a weak voice. She works here. She can help me. Dr. Aurora Campbell was a renowned doctor in the region, known for her exceptional skills and commitment to medicine. Violet, the receptionist, heard the lady's request and responded with a look of disdain. I can't bother Dr. Mendoza, our most important doctor, for someone without documents or health insurance. Please seek a public hospital. If you don't leave, I'll have to call security. Her voice was firm, emphasizing the hospital's strict policy. The lady, increasingly weak, leaned on the counter, struggling to stay conscious. Damien, watching this scene in disbelief, felt a great indignation. He knew the hospital was exclusive, but the woman's condition was clearly critical. Where was the oath that all doctors take upon graduating? Without a second thought, he approached. Wait, I can help, he said, addressing the lady. Let's take her to one of the consultation rooms and see what's going on. Violet looked at him surprised, mumbling something about hospital policies, but Damien was already helping the lady walk toward one of the consultation rooms. He knew he might face consequences for his action, but the need to help someone in distress spoke louder. Damien, with a mix of concern and determination, held the lady by the arm, guiding her carefully to an empty consultation room. She was visibly weak, barely able to keep her eyes open, and her breathing was labored. Stay calm. Everything will be all right. Damien spoke in a gentle tone, trying to soothe her as he opened the door to the consultation room. Once inside the consultation room, the lady asked Damien with visible effort, Are you a doctor? He replied as he helped her sit on a reclining chair. No, I'm a nurse, but I'm studying hard to be a doctor one day. I haven't been working here long, but I'm good at what I do. He spoke with a mix of humility and pride while quickly assessing the lady's condition. Damien noticed the lady was experiencing a drop in blood pressure and suspected a cardiac issue. I'm going to check your pressure and give you something to stabilize it, he said, fetching a sphygmomanometer and a stethoscope. As he performed the procedure, he talked to her, trying to keep her conscious and calm. After measuring the pressure and performing a brief auscultation, Damien administered medication to stabilize the lady's blood pressure. This should help with your pressure, but you need a more detailed examination, especially for your heart, he explained with evident concern in his voice. He then decided to take her to the staff restroom, a more secluded place where she wouldn't attract the attention of the hospital's administration or other patients. Stay here until I finish my shift. I'll come back to see how you're doing and help in any way I can, Damien assured, covering her with a blanket to ensure her comfort. The lady, now a bit more stable, looked at Damien with gratitude. Thank you, young man, you are an angel, she said with a weak but sincere voice. Damien smiled slightly, relieved to have been able to help, but aware he still had a long day ahead. He left the room, quietly closing the door behind him, and returned to his duties, worried but hopeful he could do more for the lady later. At the end of his shift, Damien was abruptly called to Dr. Harrison's office, his boss. He entered the office, an imposing space that reflected Dr. Harrison's authority at the hospital. Sitting behind a large desk, Dr. Harrison looked at Damien with a stern expression. "Damien Montgomery, once again Violet informed me about today's incident. You treated an elderly woman without documents and worse, without means to pay. This is unacceptable," Dr. Harrison began, in a tone that left no room for rebuttal. "You allowed someone of lower level into the hospital without authorization and even used our resources to treat her." Damien, maintaining his composure, tried to explain. "Dr. Harrison, I understand the hospital's policy, but that lady needed help. Every human being deserves to be treated with dignity, regardless of their social status. I'm willing to cover the cost of the care, even if it means deducting it from my salary." Dr. Harrison, however, didn't let Damien finish. "Damien, what you did goes against all our rules. This isn't just about money, it's about principle. You're fired. You can leave now." Dr. Harrison's voice was cold, making it clear there was no room for discussion or appeal. Damien felt a mix of indignation and desolation. He knew he was doing the right thing in helping the lady, but now he was facing the consequences of his actions. He stood up, giving Dr. Harrison one last look, and left the office in silence. Walking towards the restroom where he had left the lady, Damien was engulfed in a cloud of concerns. He wondered how he would support his family and take care of his daughter now that he had lost his job. The responsibility weighed heavily on his shoulders, but at the moment, he knew he needed to focus on the well-being of the lady he had helped. Upon arriving at the room, he found the lady asleep, her breathing now more stable. Gently, Damien woke her up. "I'm sorry to wake you, but I need to talk to you," he said softly. The lady slowly opened her eyes, seeming a bit stronger than before. "How are you feeling?" Damien asked, genuinely concerned. The lady looked at him with gratitude. "I'm feeling better, thanks to you," she replied, "but I don't want to cause any more trouble. I can leave now." Damien, however, insisted. "I can't let you go like this. Please come with me to my home. I insist. You need a place to rest and recover." She hesitated, but Damien's sincere concern convinced her. "All right, I accept your kindness," she said with a still weak voice. "But this didn't cause you any trouble, did it? Your boss, he didn't complain to you?" Damien paused for a moment, considering how to respond. "My boss is a difficult person to deal with, that's true," Damien began. "He was transferred here not long ago and has been strict with the hospital's rules. But don't worry about that now. What's important is that you're okay." He tried to keep a neutral tone, avoiding revealing the truth about his firing. Damien then helped Mrs. Evelyn to her feet and accompanied her to the hospital exit. He felt a mix of emotions, concern for his own future, satisfaction for doing the right thing, and some relief for leaving behind such a rigid work environment. As they walked slowly, Damien thought about how he would explain the situation to Eleanor and how they would face the challenges that lay ahead. While Damien drove, Mrs. Evelyn sat beside him, looking timidly out the window. The silence was only broken by the soft hum of the engine and the occasional noise of the city passing by outside. Damien broke the silence. "I hope you like the food my wife makes. She's preparing a nice dinner with lots of care. I've already told her about you. She's a very understanding and welcoming woman." Mrs. Evelyn turned to him, a bit apprehensive. "Your wife won't be upset about receiving a surprise visitor like me?" she asked with a fragile voice. Damien smiled lightly. "No, of course not. Eleanor has always been an amazing woman, plus she has a big heart, don't worry." The car continued on its way, and Mrs. Evelyn seemed to lose herself in thought, looking at the streets moving by outside. "What's your name?" Damien asked, trying to keep the conversation light. "My name is Evelyn," she answered. "Mrs. Evelyn." Damien then gently asked, "Do you have family, Mrs. Evelyn?" She sighed, a look of melancholy crossing her face. "No, I'm alone now, a widow. Life has taken me down lonely paths." Damien noticed the sadness in her voice and decided not to pursue more questions. He understood that everyone carries their own pains and didn't want to intrude on her privacy. When Damien and Mrs. Evelyn entered the house, they were greeted by Eleanor's warm smile. She welcomed them without showing any sign of surprise or discomfort. despite being unaware of Damien's dismissal. He, for his part, remained calm and collected, not revealing what had happened at the hospital. Eleanor approached Mrs. Evelyn with natural kindness. "Welcome to our home," she said with a welcoming smile. "My name is Eleanor." Mrs. Evelyn, a bit shy but clearly touched by the warm reception, introduced herself. "Thank you very much. My name is Evelyn, but everyone calls me Mrs. Evelyn." Eleanor, always attentive and helpful, had set aside some clean clothes for Mrs. Evelyn. "They're not new, but they're very clean," Eleanor explained, handing the clothes to Mrs. Evelyn. "I hope they're comfortable for you." Mrs. Evelyn thanked her, visibly moved by such kindness. Moreover, Eleanor had prepared a space for Mrs. Evelyn in the living room, arranging the sofa with a clean and fragrant blanket. "You can sleep here tonight. We want you to feel at home," Eleanor said, showing the sofa. Mrs. Evelyn started to refuse, not wanting to cause any trouble, but Damien intervened. "We insist, Mrs. Evelyn. It's important to me to monitor your health tonight. Tomorrow you can decide what to do." Mrs. Evelyn, still a bit hesitant, accepted the offer. She had never been treated with such consideration and kindness before. The hospitality of Eleanor and Damien's genuine concern made her feel valued and respected. As Eleanor served dinner, Damien and Mrs. Evelyn sat in the living room. He discreetly watched over her, ensuring she was comfortable and safe. The atmosphere in Damien and Eleanor's home was one of human warmth and care, a stark contrast to the cold and impersonal environment of the hospital from which Damien had been dismissed. Mrs. Evelyn, sitting on the sofa, looked around, feeling grateful and welcomed, a rare feeling in her life in recent years. After dinner, the household's routine unfolded quietly. Damien and Eleanor put Hazel to bed, ensuring the little one was comfortable and sleepy. Then they went to check on Mrs. Evelyn. Seated on the sofa, she expressed her gratitude with simple words but laden with emotion. "Thank you for everything you're doing for me," she said, her words echoing sincerity. With Mrs. Evelyn seemingly asleep, Damien and Eleanor headed to the kitchen for a more private conversation. They spoke in low voices, careful not to disturb the night's tranquility. "Eleanor, something happened at the hospital today," Damien began hesitantly. He recounted every detail of the day, from Mrs. Evelyn's arrival to his dismissal. Eleanor listened intently, her expression alternating between concern and understanding. When Damien finished, she placed her hand on his. "You did the right thing, Damien. Helping someone in need is always the right path. God will show us a way," she said, her voice full of faith and hope. Meanwhile, from the sofa, Mrs. Evelyn was awake, listening to every word of the conversation. She had tried to sleep, but the turmoil in her mind kept her awake. Hearing about Damien's dismissal and Eleanor's concern, her heart tightened. She felt guilty for being the cause of such trouble for this generous and kind family. "The worst part," Damien continued, "is that the cost of our Hazel's treatment is increasing, Eleanor." "I don't know how we're going to manage now," said Damien, his voice laden with concern. Eleanor, despite the visible anxiety on her face, tried to maintain hope. "We will find a way to take care of our little one. God has never abandoned us, and he won't now," she replied, drawing strength from the depths of her faith to face this new adversity. Hearing those words, Mrs. Evelyn felt an even heavier weight on her heart. The concern Damien and Eleanor had for their daughter's future and the financial impact of his dismissal was very sad. "This is all my fault. If he hadn't helped me, he would still have his job," Mrs. Evelyn thought. The feeling of sadness and responsibility overwhelmed her, leaving her immersed in thoughts about how her presence had complicated the life of this family. After a restless night listening to Damien and Eleanor's worries, Mrs. Evelyn fell asleep, her thoughts still revolving around the conversation she had overheard. When the morning arrived, bringing with it the first rays of sunlight that crept through the window, she woke up feeling a bit more stable but still laden with thoughts. Damien was the first to check on her. Finding her awake, he kindly asked, "How are you feeling this morning, Mrs. Evelyn?" She replied with a slight smile, "A bit better, thank you for your concern." Damien noticed she seemed calmer, though she still carried a thoughtful expression. Eleanor, always attentive, invited Mrs. Evelyn to have breakfast with them. The aroma of fresh coffee and toasted bread filled the kitchen, creating a warm atmosphere. Despite the challenges they faced, the couple continued to treat Mrs. Evelyn with exceptional kindness. Sitting at the table with them, Mrs. Evelyn could hardly believe such generous and welcoming people existed. During breakfast, Mrs. Evelyn expressed her gratitude. "I don't know how to thank you for everything you've done for me, but I think it's time for me to go," she said, her voice loaded with gratitude and a certain reluctance to leave. Eleanor, with her usual generosity, responded, "You can stay with us as long as you need, Mrs. Evelyn." But Mrs. Evelyn insisted, "I appreciate it from the bottom of my heart, but I can't stay any longer." Understanding her decision, Damien offered money for the taxi. "I know you lost your wallet with all your documents. Please accept this for the taxi fare," he said, extending some bills. Mrs. Evelyn hesitated, but eventually accepted. "I will repay you as soon as I can," she promised. Damien smiled kindly. "Don't worry about it." With a heart full of gratitude and a mind still concerned, Mrs. Evelyn bid farewell to the couple. She left that morning, but that goodbye definitely wasn't the end of their recent friendship. Returning to the daily routine, Damien faced the new reality of being unemployed. He began the journey of looking for a new job, distributing resumes at various hospitals in Guadalajara. Each submission was accompanied by a hope mixed with anxiety. In each hospital, he left not just a piece of paper, but also the hope for an opportunity that could change the difficult situation he found himself in. While waiting for responses, Damien didn't stand still. He began to organize himself to offer small services in nearby neighborhoods, like mowing lawns or doing minor repairs. "Maybe I can help with something around here," he told neighbors, trying to find ways to bring some money home. Each task completed brought him a small financial relief, but the concern for the future remained. With the last paycheck he received from the hospital, Damien bought 2 boxes of the necessary medication for Hazel, enough to cover 2 months of treatment. As he organized the medicines, he thought, "I need to find a solution before these run out. Hazel can't be without her medication, and the money Eleanor makes at the school is only enough for our food and the installment on our little house. I need to act fast to save my family." The responsibility of caring for his daughter's health weighed on his shoulders, mixing with the fear of the unknown. Despite being focused on solving immediate problems, Damien couldn't stop worrying about Mrs. Evelyn. He often wondered if she had safely reached her destination. "I hope Mrs. Evelyn is doing well and that the Lord guides her steps and her health, and if it's your will, Father, I hope to see her again," he murmured in his nightly prayers. Damien and Eleanor, despite the challenges, maintained a strong bond. They supported each other, finding strength in one another. "We'll get through this together. We're strong. We can work on whatever is necessary. I don't mind doing 2 shifts as long as our daughter gets her treatment." "I'm with you, my love. We'll get through this like we always have," Eleanor said, trying to keep an optimistic demeanor. Damien, though worried, felt strengthened by his wife's presence and support. At dawn, the sound of the phone cut through the silence of Damien's house, awakening him from his morning thoughts. With his heart racing at the possibility of a response to the numerous resumes he had distributed, he rushed to answer. It could be an interview, he thought, with a mix of hope and anxiety. On the other end of the line, a deep and polite voice asked, "Good morning, am I speaking with Damien Montgomery?" Damien confirmed, trying to contain the nervousness in his voice. "Yes, this is me. How can I help?" The voice replied, "I'm Dr. Gilbert from the Human Resources Department of a hospital. We're interested in your profile and would like to invite you for an interview." Damien could hardly believe what he was hearing. "An interview? Are you sure it's for me?" he asked, almost stuttering. "Yes, Mr. Damien. We are impressed with your experience and would like to discuss it in person." Damien's excitement grew with each word. Then Dr. Gilbert provided the address for the interview, and to Damien's surprise, it was the address of Sunrise Care Hospital, his former place of work. Confused, he interrupted, "Sorry, could you repeat the address? It seems to be the same as Sunrise Care Hospital, where I used to work." Dr. Gilbert calmly confirmed, "Exactly, Mr. Damien, Sunrise Care Hospital." Damien was stunned. "But I was working there until recently. I was dismissed," he said, trying to understand the situation. Dr. Gilbert responded, "I'm aware of your previous situation, Mr. Damien, but we'd like to speak with you again if you're interested, of course." Damien felt a mix of emotions, surprise, and a bit of distrust. He didn't want to go back to working in such an elitist place, but in his current situation, how could he choose? "This is, unbelievable," he said in a somewhat disheartened but firm tone. "Of course I accept the interview. When should I attend?" he asked, still trying to process how this could be happening. Dr. Gilbert provided the details of the interview, saying he should come the following morning, and then said goodbye. After hanging up the phone, Damien remained still for a moment. The situation was very odd, but he was indeed going to that interview. Hazel was more important than anything. When Eleanor came home later that day, Damien couldn't wait to share the news of the call he had received. As soon as she entered, he rushed to meet her, his expression radiating a mix of nervousness and excitement. "Eleanor, you won't believe it. I received a phone call this morning," he began, barely containing his anxiety. Eleanor, noticing Damien's agitation, responded with a look of curiosity. "What happened? Any news?" Damien quickly explained about Dr. Gilbert's call and the invitation for an interview back at Sunrise Care Hospital. Hearing this, Eleanor's face lost some of its glow. "Damien, that's the hospital that dismissed you. They don't care about everyone, just those who have a lot of money." Damien nodded, understanding his wife's concerns. "I know, Eleanor, and I agree with you. But right now we need to think about Hazel. Her treatment is getting more and more expensive, and this job could help us cover the costs. I hate having to go back to such a toxic environment, but I'll do whatever it takes for our family." He spoke with a firm voice, but his eyes showed he wasn't happy. Eleanor, after a moment of reflection, agreed with a slight nod. "You're right, Damien, our priority is Hazel. But as soon as we can, we should look for something better," she said with a serene determination in her voice, albeit a bit reluctantly. Damien understood Eleanor's stance. "I promise this is a temporary solution. As soon as a better opportunity arises, I'll seize it." Right after they finished talking, Damien and Eleanor noticed that Hazel, who had been quietly playing in a corner of the room, had a high fever. Eleanor, with a mix of concern and nervousness, quickly said, "Damien, we have to take her to the hospital now. She's very hot." Without wasting time, they picked up Hazel in their arms and rushed to the pediatric hospital where she had always been treated. Upon arrival at the hospital, the situation of little Hazel was quickly assessed by the medical team. Seeing the severity, they rushed her into an emergency room, leaving Damien and Eleanor outside, filled with anxiety and fear. The hospital corridor seemed endlessly long and silent as they waited for news. Hours passed, each minute feeling like an eternity to the anxious parents. Finally, the doctor who attended Hazel appeared. With a serious expression, he informed, "Your daughter has experienced a significant deterioration. We'll need to admit her for monitoring and intensive treatment." The doctor's words struck Damien and Eleanor hard. Damien, trying to stay calm, asked, "But she's going to be okay, right?" The doctor replied, "We're going to do everything in our power. She's in good hands, but we need to act quickly." Damien nodded, feeling a mix of confidence and fear in the medical team's abilities. While Eleanor followed the doctor to see Hazel, Damien sat in one of the chairs in the corridor, his mind swirling with 1,000 thoughts. His daughter's health was his greatest concern, but the financial reality also haunted him. How are we going to pay for this? It's not covered by her health plan, he thought, feeling a tremendous weight on his heart. Damien remembered the job he had lost and the interview he had scheduled at Sunrise Care Hospital. I need this job more than ever now, he murmured to himself. His family's situation seemed increasingly desperate, and he felt the pressure to find a solution. Alone in the hospital corridor, Damien closed his eyes and offered a silent prayer, asking for strength and a way forward. That night, while Eleanor stayed at the hospital beside Hazel's bed, Damien went home carrying the weight of his worries. Before leaving, he briefly spoke with Eleanor. I'm going home to prepare for the interview tomorrow. You stay here with Hazel. I'll be back as soon as I finish. Eleanor, though worried about her daughter, knew the importance of that interview. Go, Damien, we need this. I'll stay here with her. Good luck, she said, with a look that mixed anxiety and hope. Damien barely slept that night. His thoughts were torn between concern for Hazel's health and the interview that could be the key to a turning point in his life. At dawn, he got up early, took a quick shower, and put on his best suit, reserved for special occasions. Looking at himself in the mirror, he tried to gather all the confidence he could muster. As he got ready, the image of Hazel in the hospital flooded his mind. I have to get this job, he thought, determined. For her, for Eleanor, for our family. With that thought in mind, he left the house, closing the door behind him with a renewed sense of purpose. On his way to Sunrise Care Hospital, Damien rehearsed in his mind possible questions and answers for the interview. He knew this opportunity was crucial and didn't want to leave anything to chance. "I have to show I'm the right candidate for the job despite what happened," he murmured to himself, trying to focus only on the interview. Upon arriving at the hospital, he was greeted by Dr. Gilbert, who shook his hand firmly. "Good morning, Mr. Damien. Thank you for coming. We're eager to talk to you." Damien thanked him and smiled politely, looking closely at Dr. Gilbert but not recognizing him. It was the first time he had seen this man, which left him somewhat disoriented. "Where is Dr. Harrison, the chief who fired me?" Damien thought as he walked through the familiar corridors of the hospital. With each step he noticed small changes. The atmosphere seemed different, less tense, and even the decor had changed slightly. As he walked, Damien noticed the absence of familiar faces. Violet, the receptionist who had refused to help Mrs. Evelyn, was not at her usual post. Maybe she got promoted. She was very close to Harrison, he murmured to himself, surprised by the changes. The idea that in elite hospitals like Sunrise Care, teams could be swapped according to the whims of the administration crossed his mind. Following Dr. Gilbert, Damien was led to a large meeting room. Entering, he found himself surrounded by several people seated around a long table. There were unfamiliar faces, all dressed formally, looking at him with a mix of curiosity and expectation. Damien, confused, looked to Dr. Gilbert for some explanation. Dr. Gilbert, noticing Damien's confusion, smiled and said, "Mr. Damien, let me introduce you to the new management team of Sunrise Care Hospital. We've had some significant changes recently." Damien, still trying to absorb the information, greeted the group timidly. Still trying to understand what was happening, Damien looked around the room, trying to connect faces to the roles they played in this new scenario at Sunrise Care Hospital. Then his eyes landed on a familiar yet unexpectedly different figure. Seated at the head of the table was a lady dressed elegantly, exuding an aura of authority and benevolence. Damien blinked several times, not believing what he saw. It can't be, he thought. Before Damien could verbalize his surprise, Dr. Gilbert spoke. "Indeed, Mr. Damien, this is Mrs. Evelyn Hernandez, the owner of Sunrise Care Hospital." Dr. Gilbert's words sounded like thunder in his ears. Damien looked at the lady, his mind spinning in 1,000 directions. Mrs. Evelyn Hernandez, whom Damien had met under such humble and vulnerable circumstances, now revealed herself as the owner of the hospital. She observed him with a serene gaze and a slight smile. "Damien, it's good to see you again and under such different circumstances," she said, her voice carrying both power and kindness. Damien, still shaken by the revelation, managed to stammer a response. "Mrs. Evelyn, I had no idea. How is this possible?" His voice was filled with incredulity. Mrs. Evelyn Hernandez, noticing Damien's confusion, stood up with calm elegance. "Mr. Damien, I see you're puzzled. Let me explain," she began, her serene voice immediately drawing everyone's attention in the room. "On the day you helped me, everything happened by accident. I was at a shelter for children where I volunteer and donate," explained Mrs. Evelyn, her voice reflecting a tone of sincerity and humility. "It was cleaning day, and that's why I was in such a state, dirty and disheveled. I don't usually visit my hospital often. After years dedicated to healthcare work, especially after becoming a widow with no children, I chose to focus my energies elsewhere. This hospital was already a reference point, and I have a huge team that takes care of everything for me," she continued, with everyone in the room listening intently. "But back to that specific day, I decided to walk home, an unusual choice since my driver is usually always with me. But I gave him the day off. Unfortunately, the physical effort at the shelter was more than I expected, and as I have a condition of high blood pressure, I started to feel unwell." Mrs. Evelyn paused, remembering that day. "My hospital was coincidentally very close, so I went there hoping to be helped. But as I rarely visited it, and that day I didn't have my documents with me, the hospital staff did not recognize me and did not help me. And before I could explain who I was treated very poorly, and regardless of who I was, that's not how any human being should be treated." She looked directly at Damien. "That's when you appeared, Damien. Without knowing who I was, you showed me kindness and compassion. You treated me with dignity and respect, something that unfortunately I didn't receive from the staff of my own hospital, which I built with so much work and effort." Damien listened, completely absorbed in Mrs. Evelyn's story. He remembered that day. the fragile and ill woman who had arrived at the hospital and now saw the same woman before him, revealing herself as the owner of the place. Mrs. Evelyn Hernandez, with an introspective expression, continued to narrate her story to Damien and the others present in the room. That day, I realized a grave mistake I had made by leaving the hospital in the hands of a director who hired people who did not share the values I always cherished, she began, her voice denoting a mix of sadness and determination. Since the foundation of this hospital, my instruction was always clear. All patients should be treated with dignity and respect regardless of their financial condition. Even being a private hospital, I always made sure we offered humane and inclusive care, explained Mrs. Evelyn. Her posture was that of someone who had dedicated their life to caring for others. Unfortunately, during the years I stepped away from direct management, things changed. The hospital I built with principles of compassion and equality turned into a petty and elitist place, she said with a distant look. What I saw and experienced as a patient that day was a shock to me. The way I was treated was the opposite of what I always dreamed for Sunrise Care. She paused, looking around the room. It was a painful lesson, but necessary. I realized I needed to reassume my role in managing the hospital and bring back the values I always defended. The sincerity in her voice touched everyone in the room, conveying the gravity of her words. Damien, still absorbing the magnitude of that revelation, expressed his surprise and confusion. Mrs. Evelyn, why didn't you reveal who you were when you started to feel better? I'm not angry, just... I don't understand, he said, his voice reflecting genuine perplexity. Mrs. Evelyn responded with thoughtful calmness. Damien, after being cared for by you, I felt that not everything was lost at Sunrise Care. I saw in you an incredible human being, someone who embodied the values I always cherished. If I had revealed my identity at that moment, it could alter the pure and genuine nature of our interaction. I wanted to learn more about you, about the hospital through your eyes, without influences. Damien nodded slowly, beginning to understand. So all this made sense. Your choice to remain anonymous was a way to preserve the true nature of our interaction at that moment, he said, reflecting on the events. Mrs. Evelyn continued with a more serious tone of voice. Moreover, Damien, I unintentionally heard the conversation you had with your wife about your daughter's illness and about your dismissal. I apologize for that. It wasn't my intention to listen, but it was the final straw that made me act. I knew I needed to intervene in the hospital to restore the values it had lost. She paused for a moment, looking at Damien with a mix of empathy and determination. What you went through and the concerns for your daughter, my heart was moved. I couldn't stand by knowing that people like you who bring compassion and humanity to medicine were being pushed away. Mrs. Evelyn Hernandez, with a determined expression, continued to explain the changes she had implemented at Sunrise Care Hospital. After everything that happened, I decided to return to the hospital and make some significant changes. I believe the culture of a hospital starts with the people who work there. I rehired my old and loyal friend Dr. Gilbert to take over the management of the hospital again. He is a man of strong values and kindness, someone I've always trusted to maintain the principles I set for Sunrise Care, she said, looking at Dr. Gilbert with a nod of mutual respect. Mrs. Evelyn went on. As for Dr. Harrison, the receptionist, and others who were misaligned with our principles, I made the decision to let them go. It was crucial that we restored the original spirit of compassion and excellence that always defined this hospital. Her voice was firm, reflecting the seriousness of her actions. She then turned back to Damien. After reorganizing the team, I asked Dr. Gilbert to contact you. We have a proposal to make. Mrs. Evelyn paused, looking at Damien with an expression of expectation. I am 75 years old and no longer have the strength and energy I once had. I do not wish to spend the remaining years of my life entirely within the walls of this hospital. So, Damien, we want to know if you accept the position of head nurse, with direct training under Dr. Gilbert's supervision. The goal is to prepare you to eventually take over the management of Sunrise Care Hospital when you're ready. Mrs. Evelyn watched Damien attentively, waiting for his response. Damien, still trying to process the reality of the moment, felt as if he was in a dream. Is this really happening? He asked himself, his voice laden with emotion. When Mrs. Evelyn confirmed the proposal, he accepted immediately, without hesitation. This is more than a dream come true. It's something I never imagined possible, he said, his voice trembling with emotion. His eyes filled with tears, a reflection of the joy and gratitude he felt. Mrs. Evelyn, observing Damien's reaction, smiled with satisfaction. "I am very happy, Damien. Now I truly feel relieved to leave the hospital in the hands of good people like you." The compassion and sincerity in her voice were evident. Then, with a gesture that surprised Damien even more, Mrs. Evelyn pulled out a check from her bag. "I have one more thing for you, Damien," she said, handing him the check. "This is to cover the complete treatment of Hazel at the best pediatric hospital with everything she's entitled to. I want to ensure that your daughter receives the best possible care and finds a cure as soon as possible." Damien, holding the check in his hands, felt an overwhelming wave of emotions. Tears streamed down his face as he looked at Mrs. Evelyn, incredulous. I don't know what to say. This is more than I could ever ask for or imagine," he stammered, his voice choked with emotion. Damien looked around the room, seeing the faces of those present, all touched by the scene. Dr. Gilbert, with a kind smile, nodded in approval, recognizing the nobility of Mrs. Evelyn's gesture. Damien, with the check in hand, felt profound gratitude. "Mrs. Evelyn, Dr. Gilbert, I promise to honor this trust and do everything in my power to live up to this opportunity, and I have no words to thank you for what you're doing for my daughter." His words were sincere, laden with a promise of endless dedication and gratitude. Leaving the meeting room, Damien felt completely shocked, his hands trembling and his mind racing. He needed to share the news with Eleanor immediately. Grabbing his cell phone, he called her, and as soon as she answered, the words poured out of his mouth, a mix of joy and disbelief. "Eleanor, you won't believe what happened," he said, breathless with emotion. On the other end of the line, Eleanor listened attentively, tears of emotion beginning to form in her eyes. "Damien, what happened? Are you okay?" she asked, concerned. Damien, still trying to catch his breath, explained everything, from the job offer to the check for Hazel's treatment. "Eleanor, our lives are going to change. Mrs. Evelyn, she paid for Hazel's treatment, and I'm going to be the head nurse with the prospect of managing the hospital in the future." Eleanor, on the other end of the line, began to cry with relief and happiness. "That's incredible, Damien. It's a miracle. How is this possible?" she exclaimed, her voice choked with emotion. "I don't know, Eleanor. It feels like a dream." A gesture of kindness turned into this surreal turnaround. Damien replied, still in a state of shock. Both felt as if a ton had been lifted from their shoulders. In the following days, Damien assumed his new position at Sunrise Care Hospital. He could see that things had indeed changed for the better. There was a new spirit in the air, an energy of renewal and compassion that permeated the corridors and rooms of the hospital. Inspired by this new phase, Damien made a proposal to Mrs. Evelyn. "Mrs. Evelyn, I have an idea. How about we open a separate wing of the hospital to serve needy people? We could offer quality treatment for free or at a very reduced cost." Mrs. Evelyn listened to Damien's proposal with attention, a gleam of approval in her eyes. "Damien, that's a wonderful idea," she replied, excited. "Let's do it. I'll allocate the necessary budget for the construction of a community hospital next to Sunrise Care. It won't be just a wing, it will be a place where those in need can receive quality care without worrying about costs." Mrs. Evelyn's decision was celebrated as an innovative step and an example of social responsibility in the healthcare sector. The project for the community hospital quickly took shape, with Damien working side by side with Mrs. Evelyn and Dr. Gilbert to ensure everything went according to plan. The dream of accessible and quality healthcare was becoming a reality, and Damien felt deeply grateful and moved to be part of this change. He knew this was just the beginning of a new chapter, both for Sunrise Care Hospital and for the community it would serve. On the day of the opening of the new hospital, named Hazel Hospital in honor of Damien's daughter, emotion filled the air. Mrs. Evelyn Hernandez, with a look of pride and contentment, took the podium to make her speech. The sky was clear, and a gentle breeze accompanied her words, touching deeply all those present. "Dear friends and colleagues, today is not just the opening of a hospital, but the celebration of a principle that should guide us all, helping without looking at whom," began Mrs. Evelyn, her voice strong, echoing through the space. "This hospital is the fruit of a simple act of kindness, a genuine gesture of care for a stranger which transformed lives and reignited the flame of hope and humanity in our hearts. May Hazel Hospital be a beacon of compassion, a place where every person who passes through its doors feels the power of healing that comes not only from medicine but also from love and solidarity. Damien and Eleanor were there, witnessing the birth of a dream that began with a simple act of kindness and now materialized in the form of Hazel Hospital, a legacy of love, care and humanity. It was a moment they would forever hold dear, a poignant reminder of the power of compassion and the change that a single gesture can bring. If you've loved this story, I invite you to express your enjoyment with a like and join our community by subscribing to the channel. Your support inspires us to continue bringing thrilling stories almost every day. Don't miss out on the next extraordinary narration that is now appearing on your screen. We greatly value your support. See you soon.